as I was interviewing with the Cartoon Network people to come over and start the studio, even though Linda was like, yeah, come over and start the studio, I had to meet, I didn't really know Mike Lazo at the time. I didn't really know Betty at the time because I was working for Hanna-Barbera, which was Fred. So Fred was really the interface with all those folks. But I knew Linda because she was more of a day-to-day person. And of course I knew Gendy. But as I was getting ready to go over and start the studio, I had dinner with Gendy. And I remember at that dinner specifically, I said to Gendy, "Look, Gendy, what do you want? Like, what are you looking for in this studio? What would you want? What would you want it to be like?" And he said, "I just want there to be a good vibe."
Hmm.
And I never forgot those words. And to me, ultimately, that meant a good culture, and make sure that the culture was right for the creative. And that's exactly what they weren't getting on the Warner side, what they had on the Hanna-Barbera side. Because on the Hanna-Barbera side, there was, again, so much history with Hanna-Barbera. Everybody, it was a great place to work because you really knew you were part of a historical place. The Hanna-Barbera studio was a historical place. And everyone loved working there. I don't think there's anybody that passed through Hanna-Barbera stores that wasn't sort of in awe of this place they're working at. Because as you're saying, cartoon was sort of your childhood. I can tell you Hanna-Barbera was my childhood, right? So that was, for me, that was my childhood. So to ultimately come into the studio where those cartoons were made, and they were in that studio since the 60s. So to come into that studio where those cartoons were made was, nothing short of like spectacular to be there. So,
hey guys, it's your host Julian. Before I do a little bit of the episode breakdown, I wanted to say that there will be 2 clips that we added after this video was recorded with my guest this week, former general manager of Cartoon Network Studios, Brian Miller. In this episode, we chat the early days of Cartoon Network Studios and how a culture was developed and built over the years, the mergers that happened while Brian was there, J.G. Quintel earning a Lifetime Achievement Award at the age of 30, and so much more. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to What's in My Head podcast. I'm here with Julian. Today I'm joined by Mr. Brian Miller. Brian, how are you, sir?
I'm well. How are you?
Fantastic, man. So we just passed the 30th anniversary of Cartoon Network. You had a huge part in the 30th anniversary. Well, not so much the 30th anniversary, but the 21 years, excuse me, that you were there at Cartoon Network, man. So when you hear that network, that name come up, Cartoon Network, man, what's the first thought that comes to your mind?
I mean, for me, Cartoon Network was always about the freedom of creativity and the ability to allow people to be creative, and as a result, create some of the best programming that I've ever worked on, for sure.
Absolutely, man. I can't agree more. I said it so many times throughout these podcasts. The Cartoon Network was like my moral compass. It was the network for me. It was my favorite channel of all time. I mean, getting to sit back and just watch what these guys and gals created and what you guys helped foster, that culture, if you will, at Cartoon Network. It seemed fun. It seemed like it was meant just for kids, man. It didn't matter what the cartoon was about. But when I was growing up, man, there was no place I wanted to be on a Friday night than sitting my ass right on my couch watching whatever cartoon was popping up that day, man. So taking a step back, man, how did you get to Cartoon Network? And for the fans that might not know your story, how did you end up at Cartoon Network?
Wow. Okay, well, let's see. So I spent a lot of years at a company called Deke Animation,
Mhm.
which was, people may remember Inspector Gadget, Sonic the Hedgehog. Um, I mean, hundreds of shows. I mean, ultimately, Deke was at that time in the 80s, 90s, was really the studio that most of their programming was based on existing IP. So it was based on toys, it was based on maybe characters in movies. It was always usually based on something else. That was the business model. So I was at Deke for 10 years. I mean, that's really where I probably learned more there than anywhere, because it was a company where they never had a lot of money. You worked on a shoestring budget, and you did the best you could do on very little money. So going anywhere from there was only, easier, because if you can do it for nothing, you can do it when you can start to spend a little money
Yeah.
and do it better. So Deke was amazing, and I did that, like I said, for 10 years. And then I was recruited actually by Fred Seibert to come over to Hanna-Barbera. At the time, Hanna-Barbera, this was 96. At the time, Hanna-Barbera was doing The New Adventures of Johnny Quest, and it was in peril. They were millions of dollars over budget, and Fred was looking for somebody to come in as a head of production at the time to help kind of set it on course, and really help with the new series for Cartoon Network at that time.
Mhm.
So the first originals were going on at that same time. So we had Dexter still in production. Actually, it was Powerpuff going into Dexter, right? So it was Powerpuff first Dexter going into
Yeah.
Powerpuff. Yeah, Dexter going into Powerpuff, and then we had Bravo going on at the time. We had Cow and Chicken going on at the time. We had the or the What a Cartoon shorts at the same time. We had Johnny Quest. So it was a rare time at Hanna-Barbera, and it was during the early stages of the originals for Cartoon Network. So while Cartoon Network did launch in 92, I don't think the first original premiered until 95, maybe.
Yeah,
Maybe Dexter
95,
premiered in
96.
95. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think Dexter premiered in 95. So I came on the following year, and really early in the following year, and everything was still some stuff hadn't premiered. Cow and Chicken hadn't premiered. Bravo hadn't premiered at that point. So, but Fred brought me over, and I was there for 2 years until they ended up selling or merging, I would say. Turner merged with Warner Brothers,
Mhm.
and that was when Warner Brothers took over. And there's a bit of irony to the tale, because ultimately Warner Brothers shut down Hanna-Barbera
Mhm.
and took all of those productions and moved them into Warner Animation at that time. And as a result, my job was eliminated, because they had teams that were doing exactly what we did. So they just basically took our productions and moved them over to Warner Animation. And I left. I did a very small stint working at Spumco, working with John Kay. I worked on a short, which was a short that we had in production while I was at Hanna-Barbera, and that's how I met John and the folks at Spumco, which was called Boo Boo Runs Wild.
Mhm.
So I went over there and worked there for a couple of months, till I got a call from Nickelodeon, and they said they were opening their new studio in Burbank, and asked me if I would come over and head up production for them there. And I did. It was a great opportunity. And I joined them, and just as the studio was opening. And that was a great time as well. I mean, it was again, rare times. I remember my first day at Nickelodeon. They said, "Hey, here's some of the stuff that we have in production now, and here's a new show that we're putting into production, so you should watch this pilot." And the pilot was for SpongeBob, and it was Rip Pants, and I'd seen a lot. Needless to say, seen a lot of animation up to that point. And it was the first time I can remember I was sitting in the conference room alone watching the video for the pilot, and I was laughing out loud because it was so funny, and I knew this show is amazing. And they put that in production as I was starting. And again, a great slate of shows going on there, which was Angry Beavers, Hey Arnold, Cat Dog, SpongeBob just starting up. It was and then we had Fred had come over at that point there, and Fred was doing a shorts program for Nick Animation Studio as well. So I was there for 2 years at Nick Animation when I got a call from Linda Saminsky, who called and said, "Hey, this thing at Warner Brothers isn't working out. Very, we're very different culturally. We're very different. We're not a fit for what they're doing. Everyone's unhappy, basically, under the Warner roof. Will you come open a studio for us?" It was an incredible opportunity. Linda has been, she was always such a great supporter of mine. And, the answer was easy, which was yes, I would be happy to come over and open the studio, which is what I did. And that was in 2000. So I spent 2 years at Nick. So I had a 2-year contract with Nick. I spent 2 years at Nick. They called me about the middle of my second year and asked me to come over. So we just had to wait a few months, and then I started at early 2000 at Cartoon when I opened the studio. And at that time we had Powerpuff was actually, there was still an iteration of there's still an iteration of Bravo going on at that time. We ended up putting Powerpuff back in production and Dexter back in production. They were on they were a brief hold. One of the first originals we put in production at that time was Time Squad.
Yes.
And yeah, Dave Watson. And then the other was Genndy was getting ready to start Samurai Jack. So, but Genndy, I mean, the great story with me about Genndy, and Genndy and I have remained friends, of course, over the years. And in fact, I was supposed to have lunch with him today.
Oh
We
man.
were, yeah, he's amazing. But as I was interviewing with the Cartoon Network people to come over and start the studio, even though Linda was like, "Yeah, come over and start the studio," I had to meet. I didn't really know Mike Lazo at the time. I didn't really know Betty at the time because I was working for Hanna-Barbera, which was Fred. So Fred was really the interface with all those folks. But I knew Linda because she was more of a day-to-day person. And of course I knew Genndy. But as I was getting ready to go over and start the studio, I had dinner with Genndy. And I remember at that dinner specifically, I said to Genndy, "Look, Genndy, what do you want? Like, what are you looking for in this studio? What would you want? What would you want it to be like?" And he said, "I just want there to be a good vibe."
Hmm.
And I never forgot those words. And to me, ultimately, that meant a good culture, and make sure that, the culture was right for the creative. And that's exactly what they weren't getting on the Warner side, what they had on the Hanna-Barbera side. Because on the Hanna-Barbera side, there was, again, so much history with Hanna-Barbera. Everybody, it was a great place to work because you really knew you were part of a historical place. The Hanna-Barbera studio was a historical place. And everyone loved working there. I don't think there's anybody that passed through Hanna-Barbera stores that wasn't sort of in awe of this place they're working at. Because as you're saying, Cartoon was sort of your childhood. I can tell you Hanna-Barbera was my childhood, right? So that was, for me, that was my childhood. So to ultimately come into the studio where those cartoons were made, and they were in that studio since the 60s. So to come into that studio where those cartoons were made was, nothing short of like spectacular to be there.
Yeah.
If you're into anime, manga, comic books, movie reviews, or just pop culture, Spoiler Force Podcast is the place for you. Not only do I talk about nerdy topics, I have conversations with a variety of guests, such as musicians, Comic-Con artists, cosplayers, other podcasters, and people from all over the world. Join me as I go on this journey to find ways to help others express themselves with their creativity.
So everybody was very happy there, and it had a very specific culture. Warner Brothers was never that culture. So one of the biggest differences about Warner Brothers was they were a writer-driven culture. So everything they did was heavily driven by writers. And Hanna-Barbera, at the point at which Fred had come in and started the shorts program and started the 7-minute cartoon format, everything was really outline driven and board driven. So that's was a huge difference because our folks going into the Warner side weren't used to the writer being king. Honestly, I mean that's the way that's the way it went at Warner. It's like the writers were the kings,
Mhm.
and on that for the cartoon side, it was the animators, it was the artists that were also the board artists, that were the directors, that was like they were the creatives, and so the culture started with Hanna Barbera, and that was the culture that I was bringing back to the studio. The one thing they had, Julian, stop me if I'm going on too long
Absolutely no. I love this type of stuff. I love being able to sit back and just listen to stories. So please continue.
here. Okay, all right. The one thing that Hanna Barbera had for a long time, and the studio was built in such a way that it was department driven. So there were different departments that every show went through those departments. So there was a character design department, right? So every show would use that same character design team to design their characters. That's how you ultimately ended up with what you would almost call a house style, right? So if you look at some of the Hanna-Barbera cartoons over the years, there's quite a few that you'd be able to look at now, even if you didn't know, and say like, oh, that's a Hanna-Barbera cartoon, because they all kind of started to have a similar house style. Disney did the same thing for a long time. They were in a similar situation where they had departments: the character design department, the background design department, the character color department, the background color department. So everything went through these departments. And that was definitely one of the biggest things that we wanted to break and get away from. So in opening the studio, we were from the get-go, we were team-based. So these were teams dedicated to a specific show. And the director, so again, at Hanna-Barbera, at a time, you didn't really get to pick those character designers. There was a department head that would pick those character designers. So when we started on the originals, the Cartoon Network originals, Genndy got to pick his own team. Craig got to pick his own team. These were people that were handpicked and selected by them to work on their show, and it was a big difference. It made people feel more vested in the projects. You felt like you were working directly for the creative, and it was a big deal. It was a big change. It was happening at Nick when I was there for sure. Like Nick was probably one of the first studios that did start to do that. And then cartoon was absolutely, we were doing that. There was no question we were going to go down that road. So yeah, I opened the studio in 2000, and the irony of the story, going back to what I said earlier, is we went through, when I left cartoon last year, or in spring of last year, it was a result of, so now with the Discovery merger and everything that's gone on, they've actually given the studio to Warner Animation. So we came full circle.
Yeah.
I fended it off for 20 years, and we came full circle, and they never could understand why there were two animation studios. So why Warner's was like, why do we have two animation studios? Which is unfortunate, because there were really good reasons to have two animation studios, because we always remained very different, and it's not to say it's not a slight to Warner Animation. Warner Animation does a very specific thing, and that's great. I mean, and most of their stuff is library based, and it's what they do. They have a specific business model. It's what they do. Cartoon was always creating originals, because that was what our mandate was, to create originals. So it was clear to me, and of course the cartoon side, that yes, we need our own studio. We shouldn't be in your studio. And anyway, so now they've come full circle, and now they're all under sort of the Warner Animation banner for sure. One creative head oversees both groups, and that's where they're at now.
It's interesting, man. Thank you for sharing that. There's a couple things I want to circle back to, because I've heard this. I've heard the same thing you've said a couple different times. from a couple different people, especially during, if I talk to anybody that was a part of like that animation boom from the 90s, especially from the Disney side, so a lot of people say, well, it happened, with Little Mermaid, is when the animation renaissance started. And then a couple other people like, no, you kind of started to see it around Oliver Twist, the Rescuers. That's when you start to see it. But when I start to notice like, oh shit, animation's different. Oh shit, cartoons are different. Obviously, I'm way too young at that time to say cartoons are different, but I remember, like I said, it was just the cartoons that were coming off the TV were grabbing me more so than they were when you go to see a Disney movie or you see something on Nickelodeon or Disney Channel. It was different. It was like you were talking about, every person from Gendy to Craig to Van to John to Danny Antonucci, everybody had their own team when it came to character design, layouts, pictures, paints, all of this stuff. So everything looked vastly diverse, right? And one thing that I've heard people echo was that was like this energy, that was the youth, it was these young creators that were coming in, and then they had something, they had panaz, they had this I'm going to show you type of mentality, and they really elevated the game of animation in the early 90s. Did it feel like, and the only reason I have that long-winded way of saying that is just so I could get to this one question, did it feel like when you went into Cartoon Network, did it feel different? Did it feel alive? Like, what was the energy or what was the vibe like when you came in there? Obviously, you said that it built a culture, but what did it feel like to you?
Opening the studio, you mean?
Yes, sir.
Go-
Yes, sir.
Um, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were the new kids in town for sure. We were always the younger. I mean, the average age of the of the talent, the artistic teams, truly, at some point, the average age of the artist was probably 25. I mean,
So crazy.
we were young. Yeah, these were young kids. Gendy turned 30 in the early years of the studio.
Mhm.
It was this was yeah, these were the young mavericks, I guess, at the for what it was, and having come from Nickelodeon was great as well, but Nickelodeon was much more, they were creator friendly, but they were also they had they'd lost a little bit of their ability to take risks, because what happens is when you get to that number one spot, and they were number one, you have to sustain that, right?
Mhm.
So nobody wants to take any chances. It's like, just keep doing what you're doing, don't change it, we don't want to do anything too dramatically different, let's just keep doing what we're doing. And cartoon always had the advantage of you know it's like, when you're in third place, you can only go up. So just
Yeah.
keep throwing stuff at the wall. Either it's going to work, or it's not going to work. But yeah, I mean, the talent was young. They were energized. They were excited to be there, and you could feel it. I mean, you could feel it. It was different even from Hanna-Barbera. Well, Hanna-Barbera was a great place. It was more of a historical place,
Mhm.
and um, and even a lot of that talent moved into cartoon. The vibe was a very sort of different kind of vibe, because this was their place now, right? So before, they were in Joe and Bill's house, and now they were in their own house, right? So ultimately, this was their house, and this, in a lot of ways, this was Gendy and Craig's house, because when we designed the studio, even, we went to them and said, "What do you want? How do you want us to build this? What's your perfect idea of what the studio should look like?" And the first thing they said, their gut instinct was to say, "We all want offices. We want our own private offices. We want our," and we knew, like, that was never going to work.
Mhm.
So what we did was, because it would just be a bunch of walls, and then you'd be in an office building, right? So I don't think you've ever been to the studio, but
I have not,
the
no.
studio, yeah. So it was a very specific design, where it was an open floor plan, but we had cubicles, but the cubicles had doors, and the cubicles were higher than a standard cubicle. So you couldn't walk up to a cubicle and look over the top. The wall was too high, and yet they weren't against the windows. It let the natural light in. It felt open, and yet the artists got to have their privacy as well. So those were the kinds of things that we looked to the artistic teams to help us design for them. Like, what is gonna give you the best work environment so you can do your best work. And that was absolutely what we did. But yeah, we were in somebody else's house, and it was an amazing house and a historical house. And now this was a new house. This was the house that Cartoon Network built, and this was a very different place.
What was the craziest thing anybody asked for when you guys were building the studio? Does anything strike you or anything come back like, oh, we wanted a foosball table in every other room? Anything like that?
No, I mean, you'd be surprised. They were they were happy just to have a place that was their
Yeah.
own. Keep in mind, they were coming from a place where they felt they were truly oppressed, right? So they were coming from this Warner writer-driven world where they were they felt like second-class citizens, honestly. I mean, they just didn't mesh with the environment. Here's a funny story though. So when we were building this studio, we engaged an architect that was the same architect that Warner Animation engaged to open up a new building for them. So they were moving into a new building while we were opening our studio and designing our studio. So the architect, because and we didn't have a lot of money at the beginning. We really didn't have much money, and the same architect was doing both places. And I can remember one time in a design meeting, they were laughing, saying like, yeah, you are Cartoon Network compared to Warner Animation, you're like the Old Navy to the Versace. So everything on the Warner side was the most expensive, and it was just crazy. It was such a waste of money. And we were I mean, if you saw the studio in the early days, we ended up evolving and making it a little nicer. But in the early days, it was pretty raw. It was kind of like a New York, sort of lofty kind of feel, the open ceilings and the concrete floors. And it was really, it was just a cool space. There was nobody's asking for anything crazy, honestly. And things just kind of over the years evolved in terms of what we ended up adding to the studio over time. But generally speaking, yeah, there was no crazy requests.
Damn, I was hoping for something crazy. I've heard some interesting stories. Some of these stories have actually had to cut from these videos, so they kind of die with me. But yeah, so man, I was hoping. Anyways, one thing I did want to bring up. Now we'd have to leave Genndy and Craig off of this for just a second. But how long were you there? You were there for 21 years, you said?
Mhm.
That entire 21-year run, if you had to take Genndy and Craig off of this list, what shows stuck out to you as being like, oh my God, this is perfect, this is beautiful, this is amazing? Do a couple of them stick out to you as far? And
Oh, I
I
mean,
don't want to ask you this question just so you can, upset some other creators. So that's not what I'm getting at.
yeah.
But
I mean, it's hard to pick a favorite child, right? But ultimately, look, nobody can deny that Adventure Time was special. It was a
yes,
very special, special show. And I think we knew there was something unique about it when we were first going into it, but had no idea that it would turn into what it turned into. But I mean, you had Adventure Time, you had Over the Garden Wall. I mean, that was just shocking how that even came together. I mean, the way that show kind of Pat McHale really, he was making it up as he went along in a lot of ways, and it worked. He would do these storyboard pitches where he would be saying like, yeah, and something's going to happen here. I mean, nothing would be exactly clear, but we knew like Pat had something special and he was doing something really different, and so we let him go. And look, it ultimately won an Emmy, which was incredible. But yeah, you had Over the Garden Wall, you had Regular Show, you had Steven Universe. I mean, Steven Universe, there's Rebecca. It's just amazing. I mean, she's
mhm,
such a thoughtful creator, and everything she did was done with intent. I mean,
yes.
it was very special.
No wasted
Very.
movement whatsoever. Watching her and listening to her break down her show, like I've never felt dumber in the best possible way. I don't mean that as a slight towards her, but listening to her articulate why she does something, I'm just like, there, this is so much more than a cartoon. This is so much more than animation. This is, I don't even have the words to put it into like what I'm trying to describe, but it's just hearing her talk about all of this stuff. It's just like master to craft, man. She's at the highest level of animation storytelling and writing. It was just phenomenal. I couldn't agree with you more. I didn't mean to cut you off, but yeah, absolutely.
No, absolutely. No, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I knew it from, one of my first lunches with her as we were getting ready to start the show. And I there was something different about Rebecca and her intent and how she knew exactly what this was. And that doesn't always happen. I think
Mhm.
shows happen and they evolve a lot. And while Steven evolved, I still think Rebecca always knew what that show was and what that show was going to be. um so yeah, there's a lot of them. If you know I love Craig and Gendy, but there's a lot of them, which I'm honored to have been a part of.
Now, with all of these shows, now some people do and then some people don't in the animation industry. It's just like my profession for cooking. I'm one of those unicorns, they call us. I love cooking outside of work. Most of the time when you're working 60 plus hours a week, you don't want to cook when you go home, but I absolutely love it. So would you watch these cartoons as they were going on, or would you watch them like us with the audience or something like that, or would you just be like, man, it's just work, I
I
don't want
mean,
to
we
lose?
would.
What's that?
Yeah, no, we would have. I mean, we would see, work print screenings
Mhm.
of all the shows, right? We'd get all the work prints, so we'd see it absolutely as the show progressed. We would see all the shows. I wasn't watching them, as a fan per
Yeah.
se, but I was watching them from the studio's perspective. And we'd see the storyboard pitches, and we say, we track the show from start to finish. So yeah, I mean, I guess if you're comparing your question to, if you're asking me, am I like an animation, am I an animation person that just looks for every piece of animation I can absorb
Mhm.
at home? Probably not as much,
No.
to tell you the truth. I try to keep with it, but I'm not watching everything all the time. There's just so much content out there. It's hard to keep up with everything that's out there. I just
Absolutely.
learned there was just today. There's a new animated series. I guess it just premiered in September, but there's a new animated series on AMC Plus, an animated original, which that's different. AMC is into now getting into animation. So it's just, yeah, there's so much. But adult animation is doing so well that I think all of these streamers, all of these content providers are looking now to animation the way they would look at live action. It's like they're not looking at it as some sort of alien genre that's come in. They're looking at it, it's like, oh no, this could work. This could work as well as a live action show. So yeah, it's interesting how that's evolved as well.
Absolutely. And we were talking Gendy earlier. Have you gotten the chance to watch Primal yet?
Watched it all. Yeah. Have you watched it?
My God, have I? I was so, ladies and gentlemen, spoilers might come up. I try not to spoil anything, but here's your warning. One, two, three, we're talking spoilers. The ending for that. I had this talk because I had David Krentz, he's a storyboard artist, on for that one. I also had Aaron LaPlante, he's the voice of Spear, on last couple weeks. And that show, it's not a cartoon. It's not, I don't know what it is. It's a movie. It feels like a movie that's been chopped up into 20
Epic. It
parts.
is epic.
Yeah,
Yeah, it is
it's
epic.
just it's how he shot it, the way they would pan in, the way they would pan out, how they would treat their characters. The fact that there's 98% of that show is probably no dialogue whatsoever. the entire series. It's just, and then how it can have you on the edge of your seat the entire time, how you can feel for a caveman and a dinosaur. You don't know, they don't know how to talk to each other, but they figure it out down the road. They figure out how to communicate. And then you're figuring out as you go along, you're like, oh, fuck, I'm starting to care for these two characters more than I think I should. And then it's like that whole scene in Shrek, man. You peel back those layers of an onion, and that's what you get for Shrek. You got an ogre. And that's what it felt like with the show. It was like every episode was adding another layer to these characters. And it's I didn't know I didn't know what adult animation could be. You know, you see Invincible when COVID kicked off. That was crazy. And then you see Primal, you know, a couple months after that, and you're just like, holy shit, they're really putting everything into adult animation. I mean, when did you obviously Adult Swim's been around for a while, but there's been a concerted effort for the last couple of years to really start putting more focus, more money, more attention, more creators into that adult animation side. But when did you start to realize that as far as your job goes?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I mean, Adult Swim. So we were involved early on, even in Harvey Birdman, the first season of Harvey Birdman.
Gotta love that show.
We helped them get that up and running, and then eventually they took it to Atlanta because they could do it in Flash. They had a studio in Atlanta where they could do it all in Flash. So, but we were involved then in adult animation. But it was interesting because for a long time it was like Simpsons, King of the Hill.
Yes.
You had Beavis and Butthead, right? Family Guy came along. Seth was with us. You know, Seth worked on
Cow and Chicken.
Bravo, Hanna-Barbera, and Cow and Chicken. Wrote some Cow and Chicken. But there was a handful of shows, right? And Fox had them, and they had their Fox animation block. And then South Park came along, and then eventually Archer, and you saw more and more of them. But I think it's streaming now that's really, really bringing it all in terms of like, now we can do this. We're absolutely in it. I'm currently working on an HBO Max adult animated series called Fired on Mars, and it's a great show. I mean, it's kind of a dark comedy, but sometimes more dark than comedy. But it's Luke Wilson is the lead character.
Okay.
And at the studio, we did, like I said, we did some early Harvey Birdman. We did Close Enough. We were doing,
yes,
when I departed, they were in season 2, maybe wrapping up season 2. So I think it's only recently that certainly I've seen this wave sort of come in terms of adult animation, but I think it's just the beginning too.
I hope so, man, because I didn't want to get too much onto this topic, but we've talked about it a little bit with the whole merger and everything like that. There's a lot of fans that were fired up asking questions on what could be done, what could not be done. But Close Enough and JG and regular show, I don't think the episodes that you've actually gotten to hear the story, but fans have heard this one, so I'll make this one quick. When I was deployed and I came home on shore duty, I hit 3 deployments back to back to back, ranging from, I think it was like 8 months the first one, the last 2 were right at 9, almost 10 months. And at that time, I had only one son, and he was roughly 5 years old, maybe 6 years old, somewhere in that neighborhood. But for the first 4 years, you can kind of write off. I wasn't around. I was deployed the entire time. I was doing workups. I was on this side of the coast. He was on this side of the coast. So one of the things we would do whenever I would come home and have time with him was we would watch cartoons together. And Cartoon Network was, like I said, it was always been my channel. So we would watch it, and he had seen, whether it was a commercial, a superstition, he saw something with regular show, right? Mordecai and Rigby. And then I'm flipping the channels one day, and he's like, Daddy, stop. So I was like, okay. So he's like, go back. So we go back, and it's the regular show. And he's like, I was like, you like this? And he's like, yeah. He's like, let's watch this. So we start watching it. And I had given up on animation completely, written it off. I was like, I was done with it. I was just like, I've got my shows that I grew up with. It just, I couldn't connect with a lot of the shows that were on. And I'm not one of those guys that will shit on anything. It's just like, if I'm having fun, no matter what it is, I'm the worst fan and the best fan in the same place. I'm the worst and best fan. If I like it, I can suspend disbelief for 90 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it is. I have fun with it, regardless if it's good or bad. So I'm sitting here watching it. I'm laughing my ass off. So this turned into weeks of us just bonding over this show. I'm right off of deployment. I get home. He's happy. And we would actually start greeting each other. So he was in that time frame where he would start to understand, like, oh, dad kind of gets home when the sun's starting to come on this side or whatever it is, right? He really couldn't tell time. So there was first time he did it, we're walking up and we'd been watching regular show for a couple weeks at this point, and then he sees me and then he throws his hand up like Mordecai and Rigby would do, and he'd go whoa, and he would point at me as I'm coming up the driveway and shit. And then I knew what he was doing, so I wouldn't point at him. So as soon as I got in the house, I went and I pointed to him and I threw my hand up, and then he was fucking just running in circles going whoa, whoa. So that show is so fucking special. I was so bummed when they canceled Close Enough, because it felt like I was getting regular show part two, but if regular show part two was grown up in a sense. It's JG is I put him in the same vein as Craig and Gendy. I mean, he's a generational talent, right? It's it's I hope there is a landing spot where JG's working on something new, because he's one of those voices that we absolutely need in times like these, I think. So yeah,
I'm sure you'll see JG again. I don't know, what's going on over there at the moment, but I'm sure we'll see more from JG Quintel for sure. He is an amazing. He was amazing to work with. Just a pleasure to work with. Always, he was one of those creators that understood the process, like that, like there's two sides to this process, right? There's the creative, and then there's the production that you have to sort of keep these trains moving. And JG was always good about that, always understood, like, oh, okay, yeah, we gotta keep this going. And he knew when to let go and when to, he picked his battles, and he did it right. He was a pleasure.
That's cool, man. What's your favorite JG Quintel story? You got one? Maybe a lunchtime, it doesn't have to be anything incendiary, but you got anything that whenever you think of JG comes to mind right off the bat?
Yeah, I mean, I think early on when he was starting his show, I mean, it's funny because we had gone to lunch with we had gone to lunch with the overseas studio that was going to be animating the show, and a question came up, which was like, well, what are you like? It was something about sort of like, what do you wanna do next, or something like that. And JG basically, he was so confident that he basically said, like, oh, he's kind of learned, he's kind of learned everything he needs to learn, about, and that is kind of JG. I mean, JG is like, he wants to master, and that would even go to life. He would want to master life. Like, he would be like, oh yeah, I can get that, I can learn that, I know that. And that was, first of all, I always thought it was funny because, I mean, at that time he literally must have been 26 or 27. It's like, you can't possibly, he didn't have any kids. I think maybe he'd just gotten married, I don't know. But it's like, JG, there's so much of life ahead of you. But he felt like, oh no, he'd really lived a life at that point. And it was just funny. And he's such a sweetheart of a guy that you didn't, it didn't come off as arrogant. It just came off as like, okay, well, you've got a long ways to go. And then what's also funny is when he had turned 30, while he was at the studio, he was given, I forget the organization, but he was given a Lifetime Achievement Award at 30, which is hysterical. It's like, and I presented the award to him. They asked me to present the award to him. And I was like, okay, JG, well, here's your Lifetime Achievement Award at 30 years old. You've achieved this for your life. And it's like, it goes right with JG and his world. It's like, yes, I have my Lifetime Achievement Award. I don't know if Gendy's ever received a Lifetime Achievement Award.
God, can you imagine being the youngest recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award? I mean, Robert De Niro just got
one of them.
Yeah. God, that's fucking great, man. So we've kind of hit that 45-minute mark. I didn't want to keep you super long, so I figure we could start to kind of wind down here. We'll ask some fans questions,
Mhm.
and then we'll end it here, man. But I want to revisit that first question I asked you when we first started, man. What did Cartoon Network? What is it? What are the thoughts that come to mind whenever you hear the word Cartoon Network or the sentence, the phrase Cartoon Network statement? But at the end of the day, he said you did about 21 years with Cartoon Network. You made a lot of friends. You guys made a lot of hit TV shows. You guys made millions of kids happy, and I'm sure hundreds of thousands of kids upset because you can never make everybody happy. Um, but when you sit back and you look at that time with Cartoon Network, is there a moment? Is there a show, a season, a series that kind of, when you sit back, you're like, fuck, man, we did it. I helped bring this alive. Was there a crowning achievement, I guess, is what I'm getting at from those 21 years that you look back fondly on?
In terms of a show, I mean, I would say, at the time, I felt like the first show where I really felt like, wow, this is totally different, and this is going to set, um,
The bar, the standard.
yeah, it's kind of going to set a standard now, and that was Samurai Jack for sure.
Yeah.
Like what Gendy had done with Samurai Jack, we knew looking at it that time, it was like, wow, it reminded me of when Bruce Timm's Batman came out, right? It was like you looked at Bruce Timm's Batman and you knew like, wow, this is like nothing else, and it's beautiful. And I felt the same way about Samurai Jack. I knew that like, wow, this is totally and completely different. So I think that is the one time in the early days. And then, I guess it happened again with, I think, Adventure Time ultimately, right? So Adventure Time then became the show that everyone else in the industry was saying, "Where's our Adventure Time? Where's our Adventure Time?" Like that became the show that did set the bar later on in the studio's years. But the first one for the studio, without a doubt, was Samurai Jack for sure.
Yeah. That's another, like I said, I've never watched anything Gendy's ever done and been like, man, it's always been like, holy shit, he's doing something different. And it's crazy to think like you watch everything. It's the same thing with a lot of these creators, like Craig himself. If you take Gendy and Craig, you got Dexter, then you got Samurai, then you got Symbiotic Titan, you've got Primal, you got the Hotel Transylvania movies, and you got Craig, you got Powerpuff Girls, you've got Foster's Home, you've got Wander, you've got Kid Cosmic. And what are all those similarities for those? Like obviously it's Gendy and Craig, right? But what is different? Everything is different about those shows. What is the same? Nothing is the same about those shows. Each time they do something, they're doing something that's pushing the boundaries. They probably, I don't want to say they don't feel comfortable because I don't want to put words in their mouths, but they're probably pushing the limits of what they think they can accomplish with something new. And I think it's interesting. I think it's fantastic. And I think it's one of those things where if you go and you look at somebody's career and you be like, holy shit, they made an entire career and it wasn't off of that one Hanna-Barbera style. It wasn't off of that Disney style, that Nickelodeon style. Everything was different. And I just think that's something you got to hang your hat on at the end of the day. Um,
Yeah, I mean,
it,
they're constantly pushing, right? They're constantly pushing. Gendy topped himself, right? He topped
yes.
himself with his second season, his second series of Samurai Jack. The second season of Primal got better than the first. I mean, who would have thought? I mean, it's just he keeps pushing and pushing, and I think Craig's the same. They're always looking for, what's the next thing? What's the next thing?
I just think it's beautiful. I mean, I don't want to say they don't have any fear, but when you've got it dialed in and you, like I said, you're at the height of your craft. You're the master of your destiny. It's something special, and I'm so glad that I grew up in the time that I grew up, and I got to experience these cartoons firsthand. I got to see, your name up in the credits. I got to see Gendy's name in the credits. I got to see people like Robert Alvarez and Randy Myers and Linda Semensky and Betty Cohen and Fred Seibert and Danny Antonucci. It's just crazy to think that, 30 years ago when this network started, It could have been a flash in the pan, man. You guys could have lasted a year. You guys could have lasted 2 years. You guys could last 60 years. You guys could last 100 years. Who knows how long Cartoon Network's going to go? But like I said, I'm glad I got the last 30 years with Cartoon Network that I've gotten. And as we rotate into the fans' question, I've had a lot of fun with this chat, man. I really appreciated the stories that you were sharing. So anytime you want to come back on, I know we can't do your entire career in just one simple sitting because come on, Brian, you've seen your resume. You got 21 years, some of the greatest shows ever created. So I'd love to have you back on down the road if you ever want to come back on, man. So I'd like to throw that out there. And the second thing is those two questions that I gave you. So you got a Mount Rushmore. So you got 4 people plus an honorable mention, right? So who's your 4 on your Mount Rushmore as far as animators go? And then who would be your honorable mention?
So, okay. So animators, I mean, look, again, my childhood would be Hanna-Barbera. Do they count as 2 or
Yeah.
do they count as 1?
Hey, man, this is your list. You tell me.
Yeah, I mean, Hanna-Barbera would absolutely have to be on the Mount Rushmore. I would say, Gandhi. I mean, Gandhi. There's nothing quite like Gandhi. And if you look at, in terms of animators, like beautiful animation animators, the Glenn Keanes of the world.
Yes.
I mean, if you look at his work, he would have to be, on a list like that.
Oh, yeah.
But there are so many. I mean, we'll just leave it at that for now.
All right. And then you had 2 books, man. 2 books do you think anybody that's in the animation field or anybody that's a fan of animation should have on their shelves? What 2 books you recommended?
Yeah, I mean, Illusion of Life. Certainly, the Disney book is an amazing book.
Mhm.
There's also a Seamus Culhane book
Yes.
called Talking Animals and Other People,
Mhm.
which I would totally recommend people check out. There's so many art books that are worth checking out for sure.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I'd say those 2 are the ones I would recommend. There's also a Pixar book, the Creativity Book, which I can't think of the full title of, which is an incredible book to read as well. When we were setting up the studio, I was always fascinated by how Pixar had their layout for their studio and how they encouraged people to move around and run into other people by chance. And we did a little bit of that at Cartoon Network Studios, where we tried to set up the studio in such a way that you would maybe accidentally run into someone that you wouldn't run into otherwise. So what ends up happening, when people come in and they go to work, and I think it's probably any profession, they'll go to their office, they'll go to their cubicle, whatever they're doing, and they just sit. They don't get up. Maybe they'll get up and go to the kitchen that's right there on their floor and get a cup of coffee or whatever. But what we did at Cartoon Network is on every floor, and we had, I don't know, 10, 11 floors, we would have a different attraction. So if you wanted cereal, we had a cereal bar, but you had to go to the second floor of the main building to get that cereal.
Mhm.
So you couldn't get it on your floor. So if you wanted it, you'd have to go over there, and you'd probably run into somebody that you wouldn't run into otherwise. And it created this kind of ability for people to have conversations that they wouldn't have had otherwise, because really we're just creatures of habit that go and again,
Yes.
just sort of stay in our own world, and we don't ever get out. So we did that, and every floor had something different, which made people move out from their own areas and go to other places. Anyway, that I just harkens back to what I had learned about sort of the Pixar setup and how they were encouraging that as well.
That's extremely smart too. And I don't think anybody would really think about that until you have your own studio and you're like, fuck, man, what do we need here? What do we need here? That's so smart. What was your favorite floor? What was your favorite attraction? You got one?
Well, we had, I mean, I'd say one of the most popular ones certainly was we had a pancake machine. It was, yeah, it was like literally what was crazy about it. It was like, it almost looked like a Xerox machine. It was
Uh,
literally a machine. You might have seen them. They're in some hotels now. At the time, it was like the newest thing, but they're in some hotels and some airport lounges or whatever. But it literally comes out almost like a printed, it's a pancake that flops into your plate, and it looks like the size of a printer. and people love the pancake machine. I can tell you that. So, but we had icy machine. We had of course the crazy Coca-Cola machine that had 100 different flavors, and we had a kombucha bar and a
Ooh.
brewed coffee bar, and we had all kinds of stuff. And then we would do barbecues on Friday. I mean, this is a different conversation, Julian, but there's a lot of stuff that went into the studio, and the culture, going back to the culture. I mean, all of that was contributing to that culture. And on the surface, it looks like, oh, wow, these are great perks. But there was also the motivation behind it was really to keep people socializing and moving around, and keep creativity, positive, flowing positive.
That's a beautiful way to do it, man. And I really think that was something cool. I don't think anybody's ever really talked about how you guys had different attractions. Obviously, Van Partibule, he was on Johnny Bravo, creator. He was on, and he was like almost every Friday. We were having a barbecue almost once or twice a week. We were having a party everywhere. And he was like, you would just walk to other floors and other rooms, and you would see what everybody else was doing, and then you would instantly get inspired. You'd go back down to your floor, and then you'd get right back to it. So you
It
guys were
worked.
doing, yeah, you
It
guys were
worked.
doing.
Yeah.
You guys were really doing it, man. And right before we go into the fans' questions, this one's fun because this is how I actually ended up reaching out to you, because your name was dropped so many times. So during the animation recommendation, that's when you folks get to say, hey, if you liked having me on, you should reach out to such and such. So Linda actually dropped your name, and Betty dropped your name as well. So for the animation recommendation, who do you think would have a great time on the show that we should reach out to?
Who would have a great time on the show, or who should you
Yeah,
reach out to?
both,
Because the
both.
person that you should reach out to would be the ever elusive Mike Lazo. Now,
Yes.
whether or not you would get him is another story, but that he is the man. I mean, he really he was so instrumental in the network. I mean,
Yes.
I cannot say enough for what he did. I don't know if you know his story at all, but he started in the mailroom at Turner.
Yeah.
And at some point he ended up, they basically said to him, like, see those, 200 boxes over there, they're full of videotapes, go through them, and we want to make a cartoon network, tell us what to program. And literally that's what happened. And this guy, I mean, Mike is a genius. I mean,
Yeah.
truly, he's a genius. So he would be the guy that you should definitely pursue.
Mhm.
um, you spoke to Robert Alvarez, which I'm so glad that you did, because Robert is truly a legend. I mean,
Yes.
he worked at Cartoon longer than he'd worked at any studio in his whole career, and he was such a tremendous asset for us. I mean, he's still there. I mean, he was such a tremendous asset for us, and um, like I mean, his story. I mean, he's
Yes.
incredible. I'm just so glad you. I don't know who told you to talk to him, but that was the right call. I mean, he absolutely would be the guy that you should talk to. And then, of course, I don't think you've had Gendy, right? I mean, you should.
No, I have not. Gendy's definitely we talk. Gendy comes up at least every episode, man. So my Mount Rushmore is Gendy. If I could put Gendy on all four spots, it'd be Gendy on all four spots. He is, in my
Yeah.
opinion, what some people, what Chuck Jones and Tex Avery and Will and Bill and Joe, what they are to people like Gendy and Craig and John Dilworth and all those guys. Gendy is to me. So I mean, he's like my Chuck Jones, he's my Tex Avery, he's my Walt Disney, whatever you want to put him in. He's in a league of his own, in my opinion, greatest of all time. But yeah, Gendy's definitely a guy that hopefully one day we'll have him on.
Have you had Dilworth?
No, I actually reached out to him. We're the last two Halloweens I've released Courage the Cowardly Dog episodes. Well, no, including this. Will be the second Halloween that we've actually had the podcast going. So this is our second year here. Actually, next week is our 2-year anniversary for this one.
Oh, congratulations.
So thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, when you're watching this 2 weeks ago, it was the anniversary. But last year we had David Stephen Cohen, which was the head writer for Courage. And then this year we're having Jody Gray. He was on a couple weeks ago, the composer for Courage the Cowardly Dog. So I reached out to John, but John's been busy doing a cartoon that he's working on right now. So I don't want to wait until next Halloween to have him on. But yeah, he'll be on here one day, I hope.
He is a lot of fun. He is a
Yeah.
lot of fun. So he
Yeah.
would be, I know you would enjoy having him as well.
Absolutely. So he's definitely on that list, man. And oh shit, there was a point I was gonna hit. I can't remember what it was, but nonetheless, man, let's rotate into fans' questions. I'm sure that that thought that I had will pop back up. And ladies and gentlemen, there was a lot, almost like the Betty Cohen one. I think Betty had like 247 questions, and people were still writing in questions long after I've already had her on. Just on the Adventure Time subreddit where I posted this, there was 117 questions. So we're not obviously going to ask, nowhere near the amount of questions you've written, ladies and gentlemen. But thank you for writing in. Necro Vecro wants to know, what was the hardest decision you've ever had to make at Cartoon Network Studios? Does one or two stick out to you?
Hardest decision. Ooh, it's a good question.
If you want, we can come back to that one so you can think about it.
Yeah, let me think about it. I mean, nothing immediately comes to mind as a hard decision, but yeah, let me think about it. What's the next one?
All right. This one's fun. Ethan WC. He said, best pitches that went nowhere, please spill the beans, or a project they passed on that made it big elsewhere. So was there a best pitch that went nowhere? Or a good pitch that went nowhere?
I mean, I can tell you a funny story about a pitch that actually was a good pitch that went nowhere, and there was a reason it didn't go anywhere, which was we had a pitch that was it was called Circus Peanut.
Mm-hmm.
And it basically was characters in a circus. There was a peanut character, those little candy soft marshmallow peanut things.
The worst candy in the world.
Yes.
Yeah, I know exactly.
Those are called circus peanuts.
Circus peanuts.
That's the circus peanut. So he was the character. He was the main character. Then there was a ringmaster, and then there was an elephant character, and I forget the other character. But the characters, what was interesting about this, this was just as, remember I told you how everybody was saying, where's our Adventure Time? Where's our Adventure Time? Well, this time, SpongeBob, there was no Adventure Time at this time. SpongeBob was the show, right? Yeah. So everybody was looking, for what's the next SpongeBob? So a cartoon, we had this pitch, the Circus Peanut pitch, and we took it to a focus group, and the kids loved the pitch. They were like out of their minds. They were like, this is amazing. We love it. We love it. We love it. And when we started talking to them about it, what we realized was what they loved about it was that it was so much like SpongeBob. Mm-hmm. And it was true. The Circus Peanut character was kind of the SpongeBob character. The ringmaster was kind of Mr. Krabs. Like, it was, the characters were, Squidward was the elephant. Like, they were very similar to the SpongeBob characters. But when we asked the kids, when we said to them, like, well, if this was on, when SpongeBob was on, would you watch this or would you watch SpongeBob? And unanimously, they were like, no, we watch SpongeBob. So we knew, like, yeah, wow, like, this is great. And it was Linda, I think, at the time that was like, yeah, we can't do this show because they only like it because it's like SpongeBob. It's not, it's not unique enough that they're going to watch it instead of SpongeBob. But that also goes to sort of the smart decision making that Linda and Mike would make, which would be to look at it and go like, yeah, this is like, another executive might have said like, oh my God, they love it, and it's just like SpongeBob, let's do it. And it likely would have failed because it was too similar to SpongeBob. So that's definitely one of the ones that was like, oh wow, it was a learning moment, I think, for everyone at that point.
Absolutely.
Then you had another question about
was the other one, he said if you didn't have one of those, was there a project that you guys had passed on that might have made it big somewhere else?
Well, it's the reverse of that, which was that Nickelodeon passed on Adventure Time.
Yeah, Fred said that,
So,
which was baffling. Yeah.
so we had the reverse of that, where they passed on it, we got it, and the rest is history. So
How pissed do you think they were?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think. Here's the interesting thing is it never would have been the show it was if it stayed at Nickelodeon. So because they would have never let it be what it is, they would have put the Nickelodeon
Kibosh on it.
shine on it. They would have put the Nickelodeon. They would have made it a very specific kids show, which is what Nickelodeon does. The shows are very much specifically kids. They go through a lot of focus groups, a lot of testing. So it would have never been Adventure Time as you know it. I mean, I'm sure they're not happy that we had it, but I don't know that they would have ever wanted it. They didn't want it then, and they would have never made it what it was, in my opinion.
Yeah. This one was a really good one. Frost the Lost One wants to know, what was the hardest show to watch end?
Hmm. Um. Yeah, I mean, that is a good question. I would say, I would have said at one point maybe Samurai Jack, but it ended up coming back.
Boy, did it too. Fuck that.
Yes, it
That
did.
final season, Jesus Christ, was so great. Perfect.
But we were really fortunate in that at that time, a lot of our series like went to 100 episodes,
Yeah.
and when you have that many episodes, it's run a good course. So we didn't have a lot of shows that ended. Oh, here's what I would say. Whatever happened to Robot Jones? I don't know if you know that show, but that was a show that unfortunately didn't get past the first season. And I love the style of it. The humor was great, and yeah, I never made it past the first season. So that would be the one I would say.
So there was two shows, and I'm glad you brought up that one because it was that one and Time Squad. You talked Time Squad earlier, and I had Dave Wasson on a few months back, or maybe earlier in the year. This year's starting to blend in, kind of like the last 2 years have. And I told him that I was like, I remember skipping school and staying home, and then it was roughly around when Time Squad had started. There was a few episodes out there playing, and I was like, holy shit, man, I'm glad I didn't give a shit about school at all. I was like, man, I don't care, this cartoon is great. And I was like, I learned history because of what you guys were teaching, whether it was revisionist history or not, whether it was real or not. I was learning history. So I tried to play that off to my mom, and she's like, no, you need to go to school. I was like, shit.
Yeah.
But yeah, that show, like those two shows in particular, I think had the water kind of cut off a little too early. I would have loved to see him go back a little bit longer with those ones. Where are we at here? Geppetto Tron wanted to know. He said, I'd be interested to hear about his thoughts on Adventure Time's rise to popularity. Was it expected or a complete surprise?
No, definitely a surprise.
Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, we knew there was something unique about Adventure Time for sure, but I don't think anybody had any idea that it would blow up the way it did. No, I mean, I think in making it, I think it was like, well, this is a really cool show. We all think it's cool, but we had no idea that would turn into what it turned into from the get-go. I mean, there was like I said, there's something there, but you just you can never predict that, right?
It's always interesting to see what people latch on to and what people really take in. Sometimes it's surprising. There's a second part here. He said, I'd also like to hear what his favorite era of cartoons was. Do you have a favorite era? Obviously, you talked Hanna-Barbera earlier growing up. That was your childhood right there. But do you have a favorite era?
That's right. That's more personally my era would have been my childhood would have been Hanna-Barbera for sure. I worked on a ton of 80s stuff. Not the best era of cartoons,
no, not at all.
And yet they are nostalgic to folks now, which I find humorous because it's like, really, that stuff was awful. So how could you find it nostalgic? But it is nostalgic to people who grew up on that. I think really the renaissance for animation started like late 90s, sort of that boom started again and into the early 2000s for sure.
Beautiful. And this one, another good one. Jack Dox, I think, is his name. So I apologize if I pronounced it incorrectly. So, favorite pilot that you never got to pull to series? Was there one that stuck out to you, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely. The pilot, I mean, there were multiple pilots that, I'm sorry we didn't ultimately produce, but certainly Elizabeth Ito's Welcome to My Life was a beautiful pilot. Elizabeth she was a director on Adventure Time. She ended up leaving the studio after the pilot, after Adventure Time, and did City of Ghosts for Netflix. I'm sure some of the folks out there have seen it, and did a beautiful job on City of Ghosts. But if you were able to see the pilot for Welcome to My Life, you can see the influence of Welcome to My Life on City of Ghosts. And yeah, regret that we weren't able to work together with her on that.
So what was that? What was that factor that you really wanted, or what made her stand out so much to you compared to the other ones? Like, why was this one just sticking there?
Yeah, it was a totally different style.
Mhm.
We've done it in a very unique way. We worked with a French studio on it, so the animation was very unique. But also, it was the first time we'd done anything that was came close to almost like documentary and sort of work. So she recorded her family, and her family did the voices.
Mhm.
And um, it was extremely unique and different. And again, she pulled a lot of that into City of Ghosts. And we had never done anything like that. And, I'm so, first of all, I'm a fan of documentaries anyway, but
Yeah.
it wasn't pure documentary, but you could tell by the way she was working and looked at it that this is what she did. She used real locations in it. She was very much focused on sort of highlighting the city and the town, and she's from LA, and that's that was all part of it. So yeah, very really special kind of pilot.
Absolutely. And you said she was doing that when she was working on Adventure Time, or she had already finished Adventure Time?
No, she was still working on Adventure Time, yeah, while she was doing it. So
No, was
she
there? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, I was just when she wrapped Adventure Time, she ended up leaving the studio.
Now, when somebody is a director on a show, maybe I don't know if you'd be able to answer this, but you might be able to. But when somebody's a director on a show, or somebody has got a huge role like a director or like a timing director, anything like that with these shows and these series that are going on. And with something as big as Adventure Time, I got to imagine they're being pulled pretty thin. Did you guys ever tend to not frown upon it in a bad way, but like say, hey, like let's focus on this, and then you guys can focus on your pilot, or once they were completely off the clock, they could kind of really do and pitch whatever they wanted to.
Yeah, I mean that was the hard part when because oftentimes we would be working on new pilots with people that were on staff,
Mhm.
and it was difficult for them because they had their full-time job and then they were trying to do the pilot as well, and that frequently happened. I mean, it's interesting because if I went through all the pilots we had done, I mean 70%, maybe more, were of people internal to the
Mhm.
studio. Fewer came from people outside because the talent was there and we had amazing talent. Next time we talk, we can talk about sort of, what shows begat what talent for what other shows, because that's also the way things started to turn historically in the studio, is some shows and new talent was coming in, and then that talent would end up creating their own series, and then talent from that would come and create their own series. So one would begat another, and that was a staple of the way we kind of evolved as a studio.
Beautiful. And then, like you said, Elizabeth Ito was the one that got away. Maybe down the road you can work with her again or pull her back in. I got to imagine
Yeah,
somebody like that has got ideas just firing off on all cylinders.
I know
Um,
she does. She's off
yeah,
working. Yeah, I know she's working on new stuff now. So good for her.
beautiful, man. I like to hear it. Absolutely. Um, oh man, some of these names I apologize. Bio Mega Bear. I'm just going to call you the other name that they had by it. Wanted to know how different was pitching approving of a show in the 90s to 2007 versus today. What is that process? Now, I think this is a question that was kind of in response to the Betty Cohen episode, I believe. I think we might have talked about it. I can't remember if it was on air or off air when I had Fred on a couple weeks ago. But I think Betty said that there was like a 3-card system almost, or a 3-color system: green, yellow, and red. Green meaning you don't really need anything for this show. We could probably greenlight it right now. Yellow was like, I need some, it needs a little bit of work, and then red was like, holy shit, throw it out type of thing. I think Fred came on and said that wasn't 100% how it was. Kind of, there was some things in there. But what was that process like whenever somebody would pitch a show to you? How would you guys kind of work with each other and talk with each other after that pitch was done?
Yeah, I mean, at the studio, we had, you had Mike and Linda. We had Mike and Linda for the early years of Cartoon Network Studios, maybe almost the first half of my time there. And then, and Mike and Linda, again, it was interesting because when Mike and so this would be post Fred,
Mhm.
right? So this would be post Fred, but really more studio, because by the time the studio was up, Fred was gone. Um, and really, Mike and Linda, same situation. They could kind of green light what they wanted to green light. I would say, look, I'd say the biggest difference between those days and even the days up to the days my last days, we were pretty free to make those decisions on our own. In latter years at Cartoon, you would take into consideration the international groups because global became so important that things worked everywhere in the world. So you would definitely pull the international groups, so international networks that were running Cartoon Network. You would definitely want their feedback on stuff. But for the most part, we had real freedoms in terms of what we could greenlight. Now I think it's tougher. Now I think you have to get buy-in from maybe different people that are going to be putting up money for the show. So, for example, in the Warner world, I know part of their process on some shows is they have to be able to say, like, consumer products, can you make money on this show? And then and if consumer products says, like, yeah, we know we can sell that, then that's one thing that they take into consideration. And then they'll see, international, can you sell the show? Okay, so they have to sort of go through all the stages and get all of the players to buy in before they can actually greenlight anything. So it's definitely a tougher process now than in the days of Cartoon. And it was a unique time. I mean, I don't think those days are coming back, but where you had sort of the ability to greenlight whatever you liked.
Man, I really hope it would, because I don't I don't know much about ratings. I don't know much about the bottom line for what you guys were really chasing back then. And by you guys, I mean as a network studio, you guys are trying to grow, you guys are trying to put out great cartoons. But I got to imagine, man, it was probably a pretty good financial situation for Cartoon Network at that time during that late 90s boom with all of those cartoons. I got to imagine you guys were making hand over fist when it came to the money portion.
Well, the interesting part actually about the money is the money didn't come from the kids side. The money came from the Adult Swim side. So when Lazo
Really?
started the Adult Swim block, yeah, because Adult Swim advertising is they pay a much higher price point. So the small block of Adult Swim at night carried the entire network.
That's fucking insane. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Obviously, like, you hear now. Maybe you might be able to answer this, because I've heard this on so many different occasions, and a lot of those deep cartoons were made just to sell toys. He-Man, Thundercats. There's a couple in there. I mean, you can fucking see them behind me. The Ninja Turtles, probably the biggest. Let's just make something so we sell these toys of all time, the Ninja Turtles, and then it's a $1 billion franchise 35 years later. Um,
Yep.
how how true is that, though? How true is that if your cartoon doesn't sell? Because there was actually a question, I can't find it. I've been trying to scroll back and look for it. But how true is that, where if a show is canceled, it was strictly on it just didn't sell enough toys? Because you hear that so many times. I just don't know how true that really is.
No, it's never based on does it sell. Well, not for us. I mean, it's never
Okay.
based on does it sell toys. It was because none of our shows were based on toys. So, if you got toys, that was just like bonus,
bonus.
So the biggest bonus in that world really was Powerpuff Girls. And
Yes.
Powerpuff Girls probably made $1 billion, and Powerpuff Girls made a lot of money on toys and on all kinds of product, all kinds of merchandise. But it's not something that the show lived or died on in any way, shape, or form. Now, again, I mean, if you look at the Warner shows where you have to have buy-in from that group, consumer products, if they're not selling toys, you might not get a pickup but that's part of the business model. That was never part of the business model at Cartoon. So at Cartoon, you hoped that you'd be able to sell toys.
Yeah.
But you never looked at anything and said, like, will that sell toys? There's one show we did going into it where we said, this is a toy show. We're going to get a toy partner, and this is a toy show. You know what show that is?
Is what era? I might be able to guess it.
We did more seasons, more iterations of this show than any other show at Cartoon Network. It was in production almost the entire time the studio was
Fuck.
open. It's a quiz for you, Julian.
I want to say Ed and Eddie, but that wasn't at the start. I mean, Space Ghost Coast to Coast. Was it
Ed and Eddie wasn't a studio show. That's a network.
Yeah, that was an
show.
AK. Yeah, AK owned. So I don't think that one counts. But no, I mean, you got me stumped here.
Ben 10.
Fucking Ben, really?
Ben 10 was the longest running, continuously running show in the studio. And it was made because we knew it could sell toys. And that was why we ended up making that show.
Wow, that's insane. I don't think I you could have gave me like 10 or 15 guesses and I wouldn't have guessed Ben 10. Fuck, man, that's wild.
And it sold a lot of toys. Ben 10 was a great consumer products hit.
Yeah, I remember watching that one growing up. I really had fun. My younger brother liked that one a lot more than I did because he's a couple years younger than me. So that one kind of hit like right at his like peak of cartoon watching or consuming was going on. So he really enjoyed that one. And my oldest son has actually gotten into that one as well. Like, I don't know what it is. Do you have kids? I won't ask you like anything crazy, but do you have kids?
Yep.
How old, if you don't mind me asking? Young, older?
They're not kids. They're adults.
They're adults. Okay. So
but they grew up in the era of Cartoon Network.
Maybe you noticed this because, like I said, I got a 13-year-old, I got a 1-year-old, and then we have a little girl on the way in April of next year. So we got a full house here, man. But did you ever see him go in and out on shows? Like maybe they started watching something when they were like 7, 8, and then they kind of left it because they got older, but they came back to it because that's what my son's doing now.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's been revisiting Ben 10. Ben 10's one of those ones that he won't watch for like 6, 8 months, almost a year, and then he'll come back to it. So it's always interesting to see like what he latches onto and what he comes back with. Oh, this one's a good one. Jack W212 wants to know. Curious on what his top 5 favorite Cartoon Network cartoons are. So you did there for 21 years, man. You can't really pick your favorite kid, even though we all have our favorite kids, depending on what they do and what they don't do. But what would be some of your go-to Cartoon Network shows?
Yeah, I mean, look, the ones that were originals to the studio. So let's take off Powerpuff and Dexter. Those were not originals to the studio. But when you go to the originals to the studio, you've got Regular Show, Adventure Time, Samurai Jack, Steven Universe. I think We Bare Bears is a great show.
I love that show so much. It's so fun.
Yeah. And Daniel was, again, he's another very thoughtful creator in how he executed that show.
One of my favorite anythings that I've seen was from, and I love when I can pick out something that I've experienced in my everyday life in a cartoon. And the episode, and I don't ever do this because it's so hard to remember what you did or what you had for breakfast last week, let alone that show that you worked on 7 years ago on that one episode 3 seasons ago, that type of thing. So without being out there, the episode where they were talked into getting rid of plastic bags from the grocery store, and they were all using those reusable bags, and they ended up having like 10 or 12 times the amount of reusable bags, which was damaging the ecosystem and the environment. Like whenever I see a reusable bag brought out, the first thing I think of is We Bare Bears in that episode. It's so fucking fun. So, but yeah, I love that show. It's so good. Let's see. We got here. Ooh, this one's a good one because we actually talked about this a little bit earlier. But Mike 213195 wants to know, is he interested in taking on more adult content on the animation side?
Yeah, totally. I think
Yeah.
that's where, that's where it's at. I think adult content is, like we talked about earlier, it's booming. And I think interestingly, I think kids content is going to have a little bit of a tougher time now with the streaming services, but adult is on the rise, so for sure.
Absolutely. 21 Nasty Nas wants to know, um, are there any shows out there that you would be interested in bringing back? Do you think a show out there would love to see one more season, maybe wrap it up that was left open ended?
From cartoon.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be great to see what Pat would do with more Over the Garden Wall.
Yeah.
Kind of fun.
Yeah, it would be, man. Uh, oh, this was a good one. How does he think Cartoon Network can expand the nostalgic love fans have for the golden age of Cartoon Network?
Hmm. Say the question again. How could we what?
How do you think Cartoon Network can expand the nostalgic love fans have for the golden age of Cartoon Network? I guess,
Well, I mean, I think what they're doing now, you see what their programming blocks are now, right? So for the
yeah,
30th anniversary, they've been throwing on some of the classics, and maybe they'll keep doing that. I mean, certainly that's one way. Just put some of those classics back on and see if you can maybe get a new audience to them.
yeah, yeah, man. Keep introducing.
Hmm.
Spectre 2408 wants to know, with the complete series DVD releases of Ed, Ed and Eddie and Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends soon to be coming, they're already out, ladies and gentlemen. Is there any more physical media in the works for some other cartoons that were neglected from physical media releases? Obviously, you're not with Cartoon Network Studios anymore, but when you were there, do you remember them talking or having a concerted effort to kind of push out that physical media? No.
No, no, it was just getting less and less as I was, in my days, as I was getting ready to leave, there was fewer and fewer things being released on physical media for sure.
Do you think that's
Because
a
it's
good thing or a
all,
bad thing?
I don't think it's a great thing. I mean, I think, because look what's happening now, right? They're pulling shows off of these streamers and you might not be able to find them anywhere. And so if you don't have the physical media, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
Somebody was just telling me that maybe there was one of these shows that was a write-off for one of these streamers, and it could be bought though through maybe Amazon or something, and maybe you lose it as a result of the studios writing it off, which doesn't make sense to me that if you purchase something you would lose it from your library, but I don't know. But yeah, physical media, there's nothing that's going to replace that.
Absolutely. Uh, this one we can skip. I just thought it was really funny on how he started it. And I cut off your name on the screenshot, so I apologize. They said, ask him in a hostile voice, do chicks dislike giant robot? We're talking Megas XLR. Do chicks dislike giant robots? Do you dislike giant robots? What about me? Do I dislike giant robots? What are you going to do with Megas XLR? Did you enjoy Megas XLR? That was a long-winded way of saying how much did you enjoy Megas XLR when it was coming on?
Megas was a great show. It was a fun show. It was totally different. Talk about diverse style. I mean,
Yes.
Megas was like nothing else that we had done, certainly. We went to a Japanese animation studio it didn't end up actually being animated in Japan, but they definitely wanted the anime look. And I remember we went and took it to a couple of Japanese animation studios to see if they could animate it. But am I a fan of giant robots? Absolutely. I mean, I was a fan of Gigantor. I was
Yeah.
like, one of the first giant robots. So Frankenstein Jr. There's another one. So yeah, I love giant robots.
Beautiful. Um, Fist of Gamera wants to know what show's success surprised him the most? And what is it like working on a show right before a show's first episode airs?
Hmm. Um, I think in a lot of ways, Adventure Time was a big surprise because it took off and became so big. So I would say that would be
Was
the
it
one.
big right out of the gate?
No.
No, it
No,
took.
no, it took a little time. Yeah,
Yeah,
certainly took a little time. Um, in terms of what's it like before the first show airs, that's an interesting question because really it's pretty tense.
yeah,
Just because nobody really knows how the show is going to be received. So everybody is pretty wound up and in terms of like the pressure is on, right? The creators are very, very protective of what they're doing and want to make sure that everything is perfect, and it's a pretty tense time until you get, I would say actually until you get that first show back in animation, and then the pressure starts being relieved because at least you see what it's going to look like. And then once it airs, then the pressure is then relieved again. There's a different pressure at that point in terms of ratings and the pressure of it's got to perform, but at least it's out there, and then you can kind of relax just because what will be at that point.
I wanted to unpack this question just a little bit. Do you This is a stupid question. Do you enjoy to eat? Do you like going out to restaurants? Are you a foodie? I hate using that term because it's got a negative connotation to it sometimes. But do you enjoy going out to eat to restaurants and
Yes,
stuff?
I am a foodie. Yes.
All right, cool. Perfect, man. Because what I've learned since working in the restaurant industry is when a new place opens up, you don't judge it, no matter how good it is or how bad it is. In my opinion, you shouldn't judge a restaurant on anything really for the first 6 months to a year, because when a new place opens up, you've got all of this crazy shit going on. It's the same thing when you guys were opening up the studio. You didn't know what you were going to use. 11 floors, let's put a different attraction on every one. Oh, fuck, that didn't work. So the next time you open up a studio, maybe you only do 8 attractions, right? So it's the same thing with a restaurant. Now, with the show, uh, how long in general do you guys kind of give it the, I guess, the breathing time to like grow into what it's going to be? Obviously some shows you'll sign on a creator for 2 seasons maybe, or maybe it just be one. But is there a general rule of thumb on like how much room you guys give it to let it breathe?
I mean, look, it's the times have changed. Like there was a time when I mean, the story of Rugrats is when they first put Rugrats on the
Yeah.
air, it didn't perform at all, right? But it was all they had. So they just kept playing it and playing it and playing it. And eventually it found an audience
Yeah.
because people just got used to it, and they found it and they were like, oh, look at this. Yeah, I kind of like this. And then they started watching it. Sadly, as time went on, nobody had the wherewithal to do that anymore. And now with streaming and all the analytics, it's never going to happen, right? So
Yeah.
with streaming, first of all, you need a volume of episodes to be able to get any sort of traction. So if you don't have a number of episodes where people can really get into it, then how do to your point, like I think even the volume of episodes helps you build an audience.
Mhm.
And nowadays with streaming, you might only get 8 episodes.
Yeah.
So is that going to work? And then you've got long gaps between seasons because streamers want to wait and see how it performs before they'll pick up the next 8 episodes. So it's very different time than it was before, where we could do 26 episodes and eventually it would find an audience, hopefully. But in terms of how long did that take? Yeah, I mean, it would take several months before, in the bygone days, even it would take several months. And then that would depend on how are you promoting it, and are you pushing it on the channel, and how are you really getting it out there? And that's another thing you lose with streamers, right? Your marketing is not the same when it's on a streamer. So you don't have the commercials to be able to push it. So yeah, times have definitely changed, but I get what you're saying, and you're right. Things need time to find their
Their
audience,
audience.
their
Yeah.
clients, right? Yeah.
Um, with something like Adventure Time, obviously you guys didn't know. We've had this talk already. You guys just didn't know. You never know with whatever show. You hope every show's a hit. You just don't know. But with Adventure Time, do you remember roughly like how long you guys were really watching and when it blew up? Was it in between seasons? Was it, the first season you started to see a real big gain in traction?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was definitely within the first season, for sure. We
Yeah.
saw that it was starting to find an audience, because we wouldn't have picked up a second season if we didn't
Yeah.
see that. So for sure, we saw it in the first season. Comic-Con the first year, it was not as big a deal, and then by the second year at Comic-Con, it was huge. And then as time went on, Comic-Con just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and then the cosplay was there, and it was like it became,
Massive.
cultural hit. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Um, Sorry, I'm just looking through. Some of these are the same ones. Um, this one's a good one. The Bad Batch wanted to know. My question is, what do you look for when deciding on whether a show goes to air or not? Is there any key factors that you got to make sure they check for certain boxes?
You mean in terms of greenlighting a show?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's always about story and characters, right?
Mhm.
Are there characters that you wanna see more of? Is there a story there that you want to follow? It's always what it comes down to, story and characters.
Story and characters, beautiful. Um, this one's fun. Chopping. I'm sorry, I can't even pronounce the rest of that. What was your initial reaction when Lucasfilm sold to Disney? There was a bunch of Clone War fans that wrote in. Uh,
Mm.
but what was your initial reaction when Lucas sold to Disney?
Yeah, I mean, I guess a bit surprised, but it's probably in a good place. It's probably a good move for him. I think Disney is a marketing machine,
Yeah,
certainly.
no shit, man.
Think they will take care of that brand, and I think it was probably a good move for him.
Absolutely. And before I ask you the next part, when it comes to marketing, you might not be able to answer this question, but I figured I'd throw it out there anyways. Um, is there a designated amount in the budget that you guys would allot just to marketing? And would it be divvied up between all the shows, or would one show have more because of the popularity? How does that work, I guess?
Yeah, it got harder as they. So yes, there are shows. There's a certain marketing budget.
Mhm.
There are certain shows that are become a priority, and you focus on those shows. It got harder. The bigger the slate we had, the more new shows we had, the harder it was to, because you wouldn't get your budgets wouldn't necessarily go up. So let's say you had a marketing budget in previous years that you'd have to support 3 new series with. Well, now all of a sudden you have the same budget or not much more to support 6 new series. So definitely became a challenge as time went on, and it was always kind of a frustration for the creators that they felt their show wasn't being marketed enough. But you had to prioritize. Ultimately, you had to find ways to prioritize, and that's what the marketing group would do. I mean, it was a collective decision on the Cartoon Network side, not the studio side, in terms of what the priorities would be. But yeah, marketing's tricky.
Absolutely. King Oswald wants to know, uh, why were the first seasons of the Clone Wars more child targeted than the final seasons?
Hmm. That's not our Clone Wars. So our Clone Wars was the Gendy Clone Wars, where we just had two short
Yes.
seasons. So I can't really answer that question. That's
Beautiful.
not the Gendy. The Gendy Clone Wars were the same, which were definitely older skewing.
Beautiful. Cameron writes in, and we got a couple more here. When your time at Cartoon Network ended, how would you describe the feeling you felt? Were you at peace with how it all turned out? Was there any sense of painfulness or loneliness at all? Most importantly, do you feel the last few years were mostly good? So there's a bunch of questions in that one question.
There is a bunch of questions in that one
Yeah.
question. I mean, I will say ultimately, yes, I was at peace. I could see the world was changing, and it has changed, and the days that I was there are long gone, and I was totally at peace that this was the right thing to do. Um, so, what are the other parts of that question?
The other ones were how would you describe the feelings you felt? You said you were at peace.
Yeah, I was at peace. What else?
Uh, was there any sense of painfulness or loneliness at all?
No, I mean, except for, you go to a job for 21 years, and you see all those people. The weird thing for me when I left was because the pandemic was still going on. That was the hardest part about leaving, was that I wasn't in the studio where all the people were. So it was harder to say goodbye because
Yeah.
I wasn't in a physical place to say goodbye to people. So that was the hardest part about leaving. Um, but it was definitely, the right time.
Beautiful. And then This one, Cameron always has some of the most thoughtful questions, and I really enjoy when he writes in. If you could go back in time and relive seeing any episode of any show for the first time to experience the newness and excitement all over again, what would that show be?
Hmm. I mean, again, I'm gonna probably go back to Samurai Jack.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
that's a great one to have. Um,
Primal was pretty incredible too, though. I will say the first episode of Primal was pretty insane.
there, I've went back. There's a couple episodes that I go back and I watch at least once, maybe twice a month. Red Mist, I've watched it at least once a week since that one aired, and that was the one where Spear and Fang raided they were trying to save Mira, so they raid the encampment where they have all of the slaves, and then
Mm-hmm.
the red mist rolls in, and then they all just go ape shit, no pun intended.
Mm-hmm.
I just thought that episode. It's that episode. Did you ever watch Invincible when it dropped a couple years ago on
Mm-hmm.
Amazon?
Mm-hmm.
So that train scene up until Primal was the craziest thing I'd ever seen. Where, I can't think of the guy's name. Omni-Man takes his son and then just smashes him through subways, destroying people like they were ants, because that's what he calls them ants. And up until I saw Primal, I was like, I'm watching Invincible. I was like, this is the craziest shit I've ever seen in my life. And I was just like, I don't even know how this is happening. This is like one of the how gruesome it was and how disgusting it was just seeing people blow up and shit. I was like, this is the craziest thing I've ever seen in animation. And then you see the Red Mist episode, and I'm like, man, that makes it look like Sesame Street. It was insane. Like I said, nothing but great things for me to say about Primal. Got like two more here. We'll skip that one. I try not to ask these ones, but I think it's a pretty good one. Um, they wanted to know, a bit of a controversial question. Do you believe Cartoon Network has lost its sense of innovation over the years?
Mm,
I don't want you to get in any trouble. So if you don't feel comfortable,
no,
and
I'm not a Cartoon Network, so I'm not gonna get in trouble.
I
But
know, but it might
I
ruffle some
don't.
feathers,
Here's the interesting thing. Not a lot has happened since I've left Cartoon Network, right? So there hasn't been anything really new. Baby Bears was in production when I was leaving. There's been nothing new on that I've seen from Cartoon Network since I left. In terms of the days when I was there, I mean, look, we had our bumps in the road, I would say. There were times when we probably, we went through periods where it was like, no, this has to be very much a kid 6 to 11 show. We're not making shows for ourselves. Make sure you do this. And those were times I think where we had missteps. But basically, I think we always tried to be innovative. I can't tell you where it's going to go from here, but I think during my time, we were always trying to be innovative.
well, I gotta say, man, if they ever get the chance to have you, Linda, Fred, Betty, Mike, and so many other folks come back, I really think that they could dig themselves out of this. Can't remember what they said. It was like $20 billion hole or fucking $10 billion hole they seem to be in. I feel like you could bring them back from the brink of extension, Brian. All right, so this is the last one. Uh, this one actually came up with Linda's episode too, but I'd love to hear your perspective on it. My question for Brian is if he knows the story of how the unaired Dexter's Lab episode Rude Removal and the Dawn and Gendy story were greenlit and produced. If I recall correctly, he was the executive in charge of production for at least one of these episodes. So, do you have any stories about those two episodes that they? And like I said, I'm not a professional on Brian here or any of this shit that he's talking about. I only
Yeah.
know a little bit of it from what I've read online and then what Linda's said in her couple episodes as well. But do you have anything that sticks out for those two episodes in particular?
Right. So Root Removal was already in production by the time I started. So I don't know how it got greenlit. What was the other one though? Root Removal and what?
The Dawn and Gendy story. So I don't know that
I
one.
don't know what that is, but Yeah, whatever Linda told you, she'd know better than I. She would have been the one who greenlit Rude Removal. So
Okay.
she's definitely with. It's an amazing episode. But I think for us, we had a similar. I mean, it wasn't like Rude Removal yet. In some ways, it was. We did the Powerpuff Girls opera,
Yes.
was which didn't air for a long time because they felt it couldn't air in a kids block. It ended up, in fact, airing on Adult Swim before it ever aired on Cartoon. But it was quite an episode. If you haven't seen it, it was quite an episode. So, Julian, thanks so much.
No problem, man. This has been a lot of fun, man. Where can the fans go and say, "Hey, Brian, I love that stuff you did"? If you wanted to reach out, or is there anything you're working on now that we can kind of push traffic towards that the fans should know about? I know you dropped.
Yeah, I mean,
Was it
it's
Fired on Mars?
yeah, Fired on Mars, HBO Max, which is going to premiere sometime next year. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. It's at bfredmugs. So,
And just a question: how'd you come up with B. Fred Muggs?
Fred Muggs was a monkey that was on the Today Show back in the '60s,
Hmm.
and I was always a fan of monkeys, and
Yeah,
I just took on that Fred Muggs. When I was creating email names at the time, I was like, "Oh, Fred Muggs. I'm just going to use the monkey's name," and it just stuck. So,
beautiful.
be Fred Muggs.
And you just dropped it right there, ladies and gentlemen. We'll pick this back up at a later date. What can the fans expect that we might talk about the next time you're on? I know we focused on a very narrow part of Cartoon Network history, mainly the part that kind of shaped my morale, my moral compass, my life essentially as a little kid, to almost 2008, 2009, and I kind of gave up on animation until the regular show. But what are some of those series in that time frame, probably from like 2009 to the end of your tenure, that we might talk about the next time you're on?
Yeah, I mean, I feel bad because we spent a lot of time talking about some very specific shows, probably a lot of the shows that first come to mind when people think of the studio. But really, in the course of 21 years during my tenure, I mean, there were 50 to 60 different series that were done. There were, equally as many pilots, probably twice as many pilots. And, not to mention the specials and the movies and the feature film, the Powerpuff Girls feature film, the only theatrical the studio ever did. I mean, there's so much more. So, it's like, even when we talked about, what were my favorite shows, I was sort of in that mode of like, oh, thinking about those shows that we've been talking about. But there is so many more shows that we could talk about, and the newer shows are amazing. I mean, Julia Pott, Summer Camp Island, she's done an amazing job with that. Craig of the Creek is a fantastic show. Apple and Onion, Victor and Valentino, these are all the later shows. We Bare Bears, I mean, these were shows that in and of themselves were, at a whole other time, but equally part of that Cartoon Network tone and feel. And so, yeah, happy to come back and talk more about all of those. And sorry we didn't get into much of that this time, but lots to talk about.
Beautiful. Awesome, man. Well, he's been Brian. I've been Julian. This has been What's in My Head podcast, and this has been another piece of your childhood. Good night. My guest next week for our very special Halloween edition episode of the podcast is Mr. Jody Gray, the composer for Courage the Cowardly Dog. Enjoy the teaser.
But the most fun stuff was when we played live instruments in the room. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we played instruments that we didn't know how to play. Like I played flute on a lot of stuff in Courage. I don't know how to play flute. So I go, it was like, what the hell is that sound? I don't know. So it was experimental and fun. And, Andy and I would laugh and laugh. John would come in and he would say, that sucks, or something. He would never say that, but he would force us to do something else. It was a constant thing. It was like a big sandbox, and we just went crazy. And we were really lucky in that, speaking of Linda Semensky was a big advocate of John. Mm-hmm. And she got John the gig, I guess. I don't know how it all worked out. But at the end of the day, one of the things that John did, which was really cool, was he wanted to pay tribute to Linda for helping him out So he had Muriel play sitar, which Linda Semensky played.
Really?
So that is Linda Semensky in most of those sequences with Muriel. Like Andy and I use samples and stuff, but we had Linda go into a studio in Atlanta and just record a whole bunch of tuning up and playing different stuff. It was just so cool because she was good, but you know, Muriel wasn't supposed to be that great. So Linda did this lovely stuff and it just worked. It was crazy. It was so much fun. We got to use these sitar pieces for Linda. It's great.